Hey, greetings. I'm Charles the Historian, and behind me is the home of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and Super Bowl 55, Raymond James Stadium. So the Super Bowl, of course, is going to be a huge favorite of Americans. I thought, why not kick off the new direction of my channel, History Illuminated, with a series of America's games. So we're going to learn about the history of football in the United States, not like all the way through, but just kind of how it began until it turned into the basis of the form that we have today. And there's been a lot of changes technically and culturally with the sport that we love so much. So prepare yourselves for education. So if someone was going to come to the US for the first time and they wanted like the most American thing possible, I would tell them without a doubt, go ahead and check out like a college football game. It's got everything. It's got the tailgating and the bands and the cheerleaders and the students and the tradition and the pageantry and everything. It's like so uniquely American. There's really nothing else like it. Baseball is great and all, and it's America's national pastime, but with football, it's like takes the entire community really when you look at it. So in order to kind of get to the root of it, it wasn't invented here. Well, it developed here, but the birth of it really was across the pond. It was in England, and it begins with the sport that we call soccer. Well, really, they had a thing called mob ball back in the day, and that turned into what became known as football. But it's an adaptation, just like baseball. Baseball came from a sport called rounders, so then they added different rules, made it town ball, and it turned into the form that we have. So I'm going to talk to you about the game that was adapted from, which is rugby. So there's soccer, and then rugby comes from that. So it's important to kind of understand where the father of it is. Specifically like the mythical origins of the game, and what reality can we infer from the facts, and then know how it was transmitted here. In the next video, we're going to talk about the first famous game in 1869, but right now we're going to just focus on kind of how it all began. So the sport is football, not our beloved football, but the ones that the Brits play, and they cringe when we call it soccer, which is a word we got from them, by the way. Football had been played for hundreds of years with varying rules, depending on the era and the location, but the structure was basically the same. You had a field, or a pitch as they called it, with two goals on the end. And the object was to score by putting a ball through whatever kind of goal you were using, rocks, or sometimes they had sticks or whatever. So there you have it, right? You got one side facing the other one, trying to defend their goal and advance the ball to the other. Now, that isn't exactly where our beloved football game came from, but that's the granddaddy. Soccer had a son, which was born at the rugby school, and that's who we're talking about in this video. The legend of how rugby was invented goes something like this. On a cold, wet day in 1823, some boys at the rugby school in Rugby, England were playing soccer. One of the boys, named William Webb Ellis, grew frustrated and picked up the ball and ran away with it. There being like only one ball there, the other boys attempted to tackle him to get it back, and they had so much fun doing that they invented a new game where instead of just kicking the ball all the way down the field, they would run it and try to get the ball to the end for some points. Still trying to kick it, but also, trying to get some points. It's a great story. You can imagine kids making a game up on the spot. I know that me and my friends in my neighborhood growing up would make games like this and keep adding at them a while till we actually had a pretty fun and unique game. It makes sense, right? They even named the trophy after this guy, William Webb Ellis. And, this might be a lot like our Abner Doubleday, which is the guy that supposedly invented baseball. But the story isn't verified. Nobody at the time documented it, and it was only later suggested that this is the way it went down. And I know it's a typical historian cop-out to say there's no proof for this, so I won't say that it's false. I'm merely just going to say that this is legend. It's a myth. What we do know is that soccer had many different forms, and in some cases players could pick up the ball and kick it, kind of like a quick punt in some various versions. At rugby school, they played a variant which allowed them to carry the ball, and that's where we obviously get rugby from, and that's why it's called like rugby football. In 1863, at the height of our Civil War, the association rules outlawed, I guess I should say, the association rules outlawed touching the ball with your hands. So handball was born. And the rugby school didn't follow those rules, and thus the game was called rugby football. As a side note, association football rules are where we get the word soccer from. For short, it was written as ASSOC, and the Brits, who love nicknames, added the ER at the end of everything. So it was a soccer, and then it was just shortened to soccer, and that's how we got it. So all you people calling us names for calling it soccer can shut up now. We got it from the inventors, all right? After a few decades of playing the game informally, the rules were codified in like 1845. This wouldn't be the last time they were tweaked, though. The sport began to spread as former students traveled around the UK and eventually around the world. They would bring the ball, which was starting to become a little bit pointy at the end because it was easier to carry and because kicking didn't matter as much. They would teach the boys wherever they went the rules, and the sport spread because, frankly, it's fun to play, right? So if you ever played rugby, I did for a short time at my college at UCF, but it's fun. It's like a good game. So, you know, there would eventually be a split in the 1870s after our football had begun to take shape, and this affects the sport to the day, right? The league kind of split the way that rugby was split. You know, there's different versions of it when you go to England. It's not just one rugby. And so as the game began to get more competitive, it took more and more time to practice and train, and the players all had other jobs, and they were missing work because they needed to practice, and so some of them were missing out on money. Now, back in this sports era, with all the sports, it was like seen as an amateur affair. Like, you weren't being paid to do any of this stuff. It was amateur all the way, and it goes back to the inventions of these sports at schools, like, you know, like kind of colleges and upper, you know, like what we would call high schools, but they have a different situation in England. So you know, these students would play these games on their free times, and we are currently dealing with this in college football. If you look at it, the idea that they are amateur, and sure, they might make money, but they're doing it for the love of the sport and not for the selfish need of payment. That's like what we think of when we think of like the amateur sports in college. Well, a group of these teams wanted to pay their players to cover the amount that they were losing because of practice. These were working class players, and every penny counted. So they broke away, and they formed today what is called Rugby League, and the other one remained Rugby Union. And if you watch a match today of rugby, you can tell which is which by how many players are on each team and the layout of the field. So in Rugby League there are 13 players, and in Rugby Union there's 15, and the field is smaller in Rugby League because there's fewer players. So that's kind of how those things split. And there's also a lot of minor rules, such as involuntary tackles, like you can slide down instead of being tackled in one of them. But I don't want to get into this and bog it down with this video. It would be like making a video on the differences between like the NFL and NCAA rules. There's just so many small ones, like horse collar tackles and dragging the 2 feet versus the 1 feet, that the untrained observer really wouldn't care too much about. So we're just going to move on with that. But eventually, this sport was introduced to colleges in the US, and all this is happening at the same time at sports as basketball and baseball and hockey are starting to form and become like a recognizable version of what we have. So like in the 1800s is really when you start getting like the great sports that, you know, that we think of, like when they start forming. And so, you know, college kids, when they weren't in class, they loved sports, and I can attest to this. I used to, you know, I played all the intramural teams when I was in college, and I played in a lot of sports leagues and did whatever I could to play some sports. I was young and had energy, and so that's what I did. And I know a lot of the kids liked it, so that's why college was, you know, where this stuff got birthed. And it was a male-dominated institution. They thought that young men needed healthy bodies and minds, and sports were good from camaraderie and morale and physical mental health. All of these famous people talk about how it's great and it makes you a man and all that stuff. So rugby was added, just like, you know, in England with soccer, and each school had its own variation that they were playing, which leads us to the next video in this series, which is the famous game at Rutgers in 1869. So thank you for watching. If you like this video, check out my other ones, and there's a lot more to come on this channel.